Welcome to the world of Carcraft? It's Super NES Works episode 20. Let's be frank, this week's subject, R.P.M. racing, is not a good game. It is, however, a very interesting game. It's the most traditional racing game we've yet seen on Super NES, less futuristic than F-Zero and less whatever the heck it was that Hyperzone was meant to be. It uses an isometric perspective that might remind the Nintendo faithful of Rare's R.P.M, something we'll see used to better effect than this game a few episodes from now with Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Off-Road. As a racing game, R.P.M. racing kind of sucks. It's ugly, it controls poorly, and it has a punishingly stingy career mode that demands players repeat races over and over again in order to earn enough cash to buy car upgrades, or even to pay the entry fee to advance courses. It has a heck of a story behind it though. For one, the game was programmed by the legendary Rebecca Berger Becky Heinemann, a controversial figure who made her mark on gaming in the 80s when she worked on The Bard's Tale 3. Heinemann built R.P.M. racing on the framework of an innovative 1985 racer by Electronic Arts called Racing Destruction Set. This was the racing equivalent to Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Set, a combination isometric racer and track builder that allowed players to create their own challenges. Think Excitebike, seen from an R.P.M. perspective. Though, unlike Excitebike, Racing Destruction Set didn't require the use of a tape cassette peripheral that never shipped in the US if you wanted to save your creations. R.P.M. Racing carries forward the other game's construction mode, and here it has an intuitive console-friendly interface. Better yet, the cartridge includes multiple battery-backed save slots, so you can save up to 6 of your creations with no fuss. This is the best part of R.P.M. Racing, and it raises the question of the value of customization in a game that isn't much fun to play otherwise. This game looks like a PC title. It's possibly the only game in the entire Super NES library to run entirely in, I believe, Hardware Mode 5. You hear a lot about Super NES Graphical Mode 7, which allowed programmers to stretch, rotate, and scale a bitmap background. But you hear less about other modes. Each of the system's hardware modes allowed for different combinations of colors, sprites, background layers, and other features. Modes 5 and 6 are interesting because they traded color depth for resolution. By default, the Super NES effectively output 256 by 224 pixel graphics. But it did have the ability to produce double resolution 512 by 448 visuals, a feature most often seen in the menu screens of certain RPGs in order to squeeze in more text. The trade-off was that using high-res graphics greatly reduced the number of colors available to a mere 16 at once. That's what we see in R.P.M. Racing, which looks almost exactly like it's running in an 80s computer's EGA mode. The resolution's a little different, but the overall effect is strikingly similar. This makes for one of the most unique-looking games on Super NES. It's incredibly ugly, with crummier color design than you saw even in the most basic-ass Sega Genesis or TurboGrafx 16 games. But the menu screens in particular are extremely detailed, with most of the game's graphical polish apparently invested in the fake chrome effects on buttons. And finally, to wrap things up for the strange tale of R.P.M. Racing, it was developed by a company called Silicon Synapse as, apparently, their first ever project. Now, if you've never thought to look at the Silicon Synapse website, that's fine, it doesn't exist. That company changed its name in 1993 to Blizzard Entertainment. That's right, miserable old R.P.M. Racing was the project that one of the world's greatest game developers used as their foothold to fame. Everything the company has produced since then has been indescribadly better than R.P.M. Racing, in large part because the studio's success has given it the leverage to scrap projects that strayed too far from the mark. Think Warcraft Adventurers or StarCraft Ghost. R.P.M. Racing, then, is like an amateur direct-to-video porn role lurking in the early career of an actor who went on to become a superstar. We all know it happened, but we're just too polite to talk about it. Okay, so I've been slagging on R.P.M. Racing nonstop for the past few minutes. So what makes it so awful, exactly? Well, it's just not much fun to play, basically. R.P.M. Racing, that's short for Radical Psycho Machine Racing, by the way, lets you race as one of 3 different vehicle types. There's a stock car, a RAV-style truck, and a race car. All of these car types can appear on the track simultaneously. In theory, this should work like it would in Super Mario Kart the following year, where the bulky vehicles have a weight and durability advantage in close-up situations, but can't compete once the faster cars pull away. It doesn't really work quite like that in practice, though. The smaller cars usually get trashed right at the beginning of each race, and it's hard to make up the difference from there. Each car has a damage meter, and once that's been depleted, the car explodes. A ruined car will respawn a few seconds later, but from that point on, that vehicle will only have a fraction of its original starting health level, so it takes just a few more bumps to detonate the vehicle again. It can be incredibly difficult to recover from a rough start, but if you do manage to pull ahead, you're basically guaranteed to win, at least early on. Enemy cars do get faster as you move to more advanced tracks, so in order to keep up, the game really expects you to invest in vehicular upgrades. There's a save feature here, so the car you invest in retains these improvements, but the process of actually earning those upgrades is incredibly tedious. You start out with barely any cash to your name, like $10, and you have to pay a few bucks to race on any track except the very first one. You only win a few dollars for a victory, assuming you even place first, which means that earning the scratch for even the most basic car upgrades takes several races to achieve. The more expensive improvements can require dozens of races. Technically, this is a combat racing game like R.P.M, but weapon options like mines and oil slicks are painfully expensive and will take an hour or two to purchase. And again, the racing itself just isn't fun. The isometric perspective here means you have to use RC-style controls, which isn't too hard to get used to, but what does take a lot of adjustment to is the sluggish acceleration and slippery physics of the game. It also doesn't help that the way the car sprites were drawn makes it hard to judge when you're driving straight ahead on linear stretches of track. The horizontal sprite appears to be skewed at an angle slightly, so it takes time to train yourself not to oversteer based on appearances. The course includes ramps and slopes, which also don't play very well with the isometric viewpoint. There are a few corners on the track that have to be hit very carefully at pretty much full speed, or else you'll lose momentum from braking and find yourself unable to actually drive up the subsequent incline. And it gets worse once you start dealing with non-standard road conditions. Dirt and ice are hell on the game's already iffy traction and handling, and you'll learn to hate those tracks with every ounce of your soul. These glaring issues become all the more bizarre when you consider how much attention has been invested into the tiny details here. For example, there's a consistent light source illuminating every track, and when your vehicle turns a certain way, the windshield flashes white to simulate reflecting the sun. But neat little details like this, and the general appeal of a race car career mode, can't outweigh the suffocating tedium of playing R.P.M. racing. That said, the company didn't completely disavow R.P.M. racing. Blizzard's most beloved 16-bit creation actually began life as a sequel to this game, Rock and Roll Racing. But while the two games share a genre and point of view, that's about all they have in common. Rock and Roll Racing was fun, accessible, and attractive, feeling a whole lot more like the kind of thing you've actually come to associate with the developer of Blizzard's reputation. R.P.M. Racing, on the other hand, well, everybody's got to start somewhere.